Well, it finally happened. Something that I think all of us figured was inevitable is now officially in the books. The Milwaukee Brewers trading Devin Williams earlier today. Today being Friday, as we're recording this emergency pod. The Brewers trading Devin Williams earlier today to the New York Yankees in exchange for a couple of players as well as some cash. Devin Williams going to New York. The Brewers receiving left-handed starter Nestor Cortez and infield prospect Caleb Durbin. This is the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis with you to break it down. Like I mentioned a couple seconds ago, emergency pod to respond to this. We figured this was a big enough move to jump in and get some initial reactions the day of. Spencer, you're all suited up. If you're watching on video, you can see he's got everything ready to go. He's locked in. He's got the Brewers hat on. Is that a Brewers
Course.
jersey or a Brewers hoodie? What is that you're wearing?
It's Brewers hoodie. Got it at the clubhouse sale.
Okay.
Really good deal.
Okay. There you go. So very topical. We'll jump right into this. The news breaking this morning. Spencer, I'll start with you. What was your initial reaction, number one, when you first saw the announcement? And then number two, when you saw the return?
First initial reaction when I saw the Jeff Passan tweet about that trade happening, that Devin Williams was going to the Yankees, was one, how close am I going to be on my guess for what they might get here? And two, that it just made a lot of sense. I think we both talked about it a lot. I think this was probably the number one team that we kind of had pegged as a potential partner in a trade for Devin Williams. On the return, my initial reaction was a little confused, I guess. I think, I don't know if that's the right word to use, but when I first saw it, the first one that come through was Nestor Cortez being part of the return, and it made some sense to me. I mean, I get the idea of wanting to add a starter to this current rotation. We talked about it on our last podcast. There's room for a starter, and there's probably a need for another, at least more of a sure thing in the rotation. And then my second thought was on Durbin, and I funny enough had looked at him in the AFL a few times, 5'6" guy. I just knew he was like Pat Murphy's. He would love Caleb Durbin. So when I saw him included in the trade, my initial reaction was kind of like, I wonder if Pat was actually involved in this trade in any way, because it just seems like somebody he would love. But that was more my reaction. It wasn't anything. My first thought on it, I guess, was like, okay, fine. That seems reasonable, but nothing, not as much as I probably would have hoped, but also not like shockingly low. So what about you, Jack?
Yeah, I had a similar thought when I first saw the headline come out, or the tweet from Jeff Passan just saying that it was the Yankees. No surprise there. We had talked about it on our last episode when we laid out our offseason plans. I know you had him going to the Yankees. I put together a package with the Phillies just so we didn't overlap too much, but I think we did agree that New York looked like the best fit.
Yeah.
I was surprised that this is the route the Brewers went with the return, particularly Nestor Cortez. I see the fit, I really do, and I don't think it's a bad acquisition, especially if that elbow is healthy. That was what really was giving me pause about it. He had the flexor strain in the elbow late last year, and a lot of times that can be a precursor to Tommy John. But Matt Arnold told us shortly after they officially announced the deal that they extensively looked at the medicals. They said everything came back okay. And I think in that situation too, it probably helps a little bit, and I'm not a doctor here, but it probably helps a little bit that he had that late in the season. First of all, he felt good enough to come back and pitch in the World Series. Doctors told him they actually didn't want him to, but he did come out of the bullpen in the World Series, giving up that grand slam to Freddie Freeman. But the fact that it happened late in the year and he really didn't put much stress on the elbow the rest of the way and essentially got to go almost right into a normal recovery, kind of. Matt Arnold said that he has had a normal offseason so far, and they think he's going to be a full go for spring training. But if he's healthy, I do think this is a pretty good pickup to kind of fulfill the remaining competitive right now. And that was kind of the comment Matt Arnold had when he was asked about why did you bring in a guy who's only got 1 year of control? You're swapping guys who have 1 year of control here on top of bringing in Caleb Durbin. And he basically said, all of these deals, every time we do this kind of trade, it's always about balance. He said, we feel like this is just a good balance. You have that guy who's going to help us now. and then we like how Durbin can help us both now and moving forward. I was still surprised they went that way because we had talked about this before about how we thought it was going to be something like the Devin Williams, or not the Devin Williams trade. We thought the Devin Williams trade was going to take on a similar shape to the Corbin Burnes trade.
Yeah.
And you can see it's kind of in that framework a little bit. This one's different though, because the Brewers actually acquired an established big leaguer who they're only going to have for 1 year. You did get the 2-player return. I think in terms of overall value they got to it, it makes sense. Nestor Cortez, though, while this is a little bit of a different way of going about it than we saw from the Brewers in the Corbin Burnes deal, I do think this one makes some sense because, again, if he's healthy, he's going to give the Brewers what they need most in that rotation, which is just innings, reliable innings. And I'm kind of surprised looking at the reactions that Brewers fans seem to have to this. Everybody's talking about Nestor Cortez like he's some sort of scrap heap pickup, kind of along the line some of these other pitchers the Brewers have brought in, like Aaron Savali, Frankie Montas. He's not one of those kinds of guys at all. If you look at what he's done over the last 4 seasons in New York, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I know, Spencer, you showed it to me before we jumped on here. A lot of it is like right in line with what Freddie Peralta's done in that same stretch. And I think something to note here too is that's including basically one fairly rough season in there where he was dealing with some shoulder problems and he pitched to an ERA of almost 5. But other than that, you were looking at back-to-back seasons before that where he had an ERA in the mid to upper 2s. And then you're looking at what he did last season. He started 30 games, probably would have started 31 games if they didn't bump him to the bullpen for a week or two because the Yankees were so stocked with starting pitching. He gave you that much volume, and it was quality work, too. It was an ERA in the upper 3s. And if you look at the peripherals have been very consistent from year to year. Every single year out of these last 4 that he's pitched for the Yankees, all of the peripherals have pointed to him being a reliable, I would say, middle-of-the-rotation kind of arm.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not for a team like the Yankees that is going to just try to beef up their team as much as they can with all this premium talent. But for a team like the Brewers, absolutely. And I think that you can make a pretty compelling argument that Nestor Cortez might already, if he's healthy, actually be the most reliable arm in this rotation mix now.
Yeah.
I'm not saying he's going to start opening day, but I would pencil him right next to Freddie Peralta. And granted, I haven't watched this guy pitch in person like I have for Peralta all the time. And you can kind of tell with Freddie sometimes the inconsistency. You're not necessarily going to see that if you're just looking at his season numbers. So I'm leaving in the possibility that maybe Cortez deals with something like that too. But bottom line, you look at the overall numbers and you look at the track record for the last 4 years. This is a guy who I think is really going to help the Brewers this year. I'm still a little surprised that they were okay with bringing on someone who only had that 1 year. But I think in terms of value and filling needs right now, I do think it makes some sense. Again, I would probably trust him as much as anyone in this rotation right now. I'm putting him ahead of, like Tobias Myers, Aaron Savali, guys like that, because Cortez has even better peripherals than those guys. This is not the same kind of guy, and I think that's important to note. I do think that if he's healthy, he's going to be a pretty good get for the Brewers. He profiles a lot as the kind of guy they'd like to bring into. He's not afraid to try different things, to be deceptive, to overcome some not so great stuff. But even on that not so great stuff front, like the fastball's got a lot of carry, and when he's throwing it like that from not a high slot, he does change his arm slot a lot, so you can't really look at the average release point or the average arm angle to get a good idea of what he does with that pitch. But when he does throw it from a lower slot sometimes and you can get a good amount of vert on there, that's going to be a pitch that plays well up in the strike zone. He's got the cutter. He's dabbled with a sinker at times. I think that's going to be the main adjustment the Brewers have for him. He's not a guy that they need to fix. He's not, again, like Aaron Savali or Frankie or even Tobias Myers. They don't need to fix him. He's already a good pitcher. But I think that's going to be probably the one thing they have for him. I could see them leaning into the fastball mix is pretty evenly distributed between the four-seamer, the cutter, and then ramp up that sinker usage because his fastball doesn't have a lot of arm side run. The four-seam fastball, that is, doesn't have a lot of arm side run, so they're probably going to want to get that with the sinker. And then you've kind of got everything covered with the fastballs, where you have one that's got a little bit more vert, you've got the cutter, and then you've got the sinker that's probably more of just a two-seamer because it doesn't really sink, but he's been able to get up to, if not slightly exceeding a foot of arm side run on that pitch when he does throw it. So I think that's something that they're going to work on as well. Caleb Durbin, though, is probably the one to talk about even more here, because I think he's really the centerpiece of this package, even though you're seeing Cortez as the name that everybody talks about first because he is the established big leaguer. And this is one that I'm still really not quite sure how to feel about this one yet. And I know we talked about this off the air, so to speak, before we jumped on here. I've been talking for a while. I guess I'll let you start and talk about what you see in Caleb Durbin, and I can follow up. But I can see like the high floor here, and I'm sure you'll touch on that when we talk about it. But there's a part of me that really wonders if was this the best way for the Brewers to go in a return. But either way, it very clearly seems like they're high on this guy. So I'll let you kind of take it away with him first, especially because you're more of the prospect guy, and then I'll kind of jump in with my thoughts.
Yeah. So with Durbin, I think one of the things they're definitely looking at here is what you just talked about. I think they view him as a guy with a high floor. He's very fast. Well, I shouldn't even say that. He's a very good base runner, and he's got above average speed. So he's a guy who can steal a lot of bases. I would say on like the 20-80 scale, he's probably closer to like a 55-60 speed guy, but you'd probably put it higher if you're just grading the actual base running. So good base runner. He should steal a lot of bases. That kind of fits with what the Brewers have been doing a lot of, especially last year with Murph at the helm. But I mean, I think we should probably note this is a guy who's 5'6". Like, this is one of the shorter players. If he's in MLB, he'll be one of the shorter players in MLB. If you see a picture of him and the way he's built, he has, I think Eric Longenhagen is who described him this way. He called him Tyler O'Neill if he shrunk by like 5 inches, because he's got a huge neck. He's pretty jacked. I mean, he's 185 pounds at 5'6", but he carries it really well. Like, that's impressive. I know he was a former wrestler at a pretty high level, so he's got kind of that type of build. The thing here is that there's not a lot of, at least in terms of the batted ball data, there's not a lot of power, like exit velocity in the bat. He did deal with a broken wrist in 2024, and he still ended up hitting 10 home runs, but I'll let Jack talk about it a little bit more when he gets to his part here. But like, there's an ability to pull the ball and do it on line drives and somewhat in the air, and that's a good thing. But there's also a question of whether, one, he can do that against major league pitching, and two, is it only resulting in home runs because he's playing in smaller AAA parks? He's playing in AAA parks where the ball carries better than it does in most major league parks. Like, those types of things do factor in. It's something we've talked about with Tyler Black in the past. Like, does the home run power actually show up in the big leagues like it did in the minors? Hard to say. Probably not, given his size, but that's going to be one of the bigger concerns. He's got, like, it's good swing decisions. He's got really good bat to ball abilities, so that's all good. At 5'6", you're going to have a pretty small zone. So if you're capable of laying off of stuff outside of the zone, it's going to be hard to attack you as a pitcher. And that does give him the ability to kind of get pitches in his zones pretty often. And that can help you lead to pulling the ball and creating extra base hits with line drives and stuff, where even if it's not home runs, he might have some double and triple power, especially with the solid speed that he has as well. And then defensively, he plays all over the field. He's played basically everywhere except catcher and first base. I don't think the Brewers will view him as an outfielder, but we know that they'll probably at least have him do some work there because they love having the versatility. We had a few games last year where Andrew Monasterio had to end up in the outfield just because Durbin would be more well-suited to handle that than a guy like Monasterio would be, because he's done it more recently and more often in the minors. And he grades out pretty well defensively. He doesn't have the greatest arm. That's going to be something I'm curious on, because to me, I would view Durbin as more of a second baseman. But what we've talked about all offseason is our preference being, Ortiz going to short and filling the third base spot. If they don't make a secondary move beyond this to add another infielder, which I'm not saying they will or won't, but if they don't, I think you end up moving Terang to short, which again, we've also talked about would be fine. Like defensively, you would end up in a fine position, but it's just interesting. I do wonder if they actually think he can handle third with the arm that he has. So lots of stuff to look at with Durbin. And I know you kind of dug into it a little bit more. I was trying to get work done, at least at my job. But it's an interesting profile. I like I said earlier, I had a feeling the Brewers would kind of he seemed like a Brewers type of prospect. I think the concern or the issue or however you want to word it would be, is this not a profile the Brewers are already kind of filling their roster with at a lot of spots, and how many spots on the roster can be filled with this type of profile? And I'm sure you're going to touch on that, Jack, but like if you look at it, you already have Frelick, you already have Terang. It gets hard to go beyond two guys who are basically powerless at the plate. And even like if Monasterio has to play a lot, you don't have a ton of power there. Like you're already starting to push the envelope on how much you can have in terms of just hit ability in the lineup. And I think he probably ends up fitting more in that lineup. Now, again, the ability to pull the ball on a line might create more extra base hits than a guy like Terang has produced, and even Frelick to this point. But I don't think it's ever going to be something where he's slugging. I don't think you'll ever see a super high ISO from Caleb Durbin, no matter what happens here. Like I think you could see maybe a little bit better than those two, but it's a hitterish profile rather than like a full complete profile, and that's mostly just because of his size. I don't know if he can really generate much more than he is. Like he's doing a pretty good job of generating some bat speed and some ability to hit the ball hard at his size, but he feels like a pretty maxed out player, I guess, when I look at him across the board. So there's not as much upside as you might have thought we would be looking for in a deal like this. But Jack, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, that's kind of what my sticking point is right now. It's, did they really need a guy who lacks upside offensively? Because I feel like they have enough of those guys, and it feels like more to me like what this organization needs now is guys who can start to push them over the edge a little bit offensively, because you have a group that has a built-in high floor, and that's basically what we saw in 2024. That was how they were, for the most part, able to avoid some pretty prolonged slumps. But you still had games where you were getting frustrated with the offense a little bit. And that's just a natural limitation of not having a whole lot of power in your lineup. They had enough last year where it was significantly more balanced than it was in 2023, but they still could use more. And Durbin does not help you with that. And again, like this, I don't think this is going to be the last infielder they add. I personally think there's probably one more coming after this, because Durbin could just as easily be an Andre Monasterio replacement right now as he could be, someone who you give the keys to in a starting infield role. Or maybe he's somebody who, if you sign like a Josh Rojas and platoon him with that kind of guy, I don't know. Yeah. Or maybe you pair him with Oliver Dunn. I'm not sure. Even so, Rojas isn't a power guy either. But either way, to me, I think there is another move coming. But right now, just looking at what he brings, it just seems redundant. And I don't want the Brewers to become hyper-focused on limited profiles, I guess is a good way to sum it up.
Yeah.
And when I look at this guy, again, it's really high floor. He's got all the tools the Brewers like. He's got, kind of that scrappy energy. I can guarantee already when we get to spring training, this is probably going to be Pat Murphy's guy who he raves about all spring. Yeah. It sounds like Murph is already raving about him, because when Matt Arnold said that Murph, because he lives in Arizona, has been watching this kid play in the AFL and, couldn't stop going on about him, and he's pumped up about it. Like, as he said that, I was sitting there thinking this is like the most on-brand thing. I was expecting in my head to hear something along those lines once we got some official comments from Brewers personnel about the deal, so that doesn't surprise me at all. But there is a limit to a player like that. And to me, it all just comes down to how much power are we going to see in the big leagues? And that was the question that I asked Matt Arnold because again, so you look on the surface level, first of all, like the exit velocities sucked in AAA in 2024. They did. He was fantastic at so many other things. I mean, this guy drew more walks than strikeouts. He struck out like 9% of the time
Yeah.
only. Like that's extremely impressive at any level. And to do it at AAA when your strikeout rate is that low in AAA, you know this guy is going to make a ton of contact even against big league pitching. And you know he's probably going to get on base quite a decent amount against big league pitching, giving him a chance to use that speed. But I really don't know how much he's going to hit for power. It's kind of tough to say because, just based on the exit velocities alone, that immediately puts him into actually it probably puts him into worse territory than Sal Frelick and Bryce Terang because I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I know Sal for sure. I think Sal actually had slightly better hard hit numbers in AAA than Durbin did in 24. And I know there was the wrist thing that you have to think about a little bit, so that definitely could be impacting him a little bit. But the wrist injury was a midseason thing. Over the first couple months of the year in AAA, his average exit velocity, so I have it up in front of me on Savant. In March and April, his average exit velocity was 83.7 miles an hour. In May, it was 84.5. So, like, this was not something that was a problem after he hurt his wrist. It was a problem already in the season. And granted, we're dealing with limited data here, and this is still the day of the trade, so maybe there's something I'm missing. But based on that, that does not already give you a good start. And it is really tempting to just throw him into the Frelick and Terang profile. And we've seen that those guys just have not hit for power. And kind of what we've seen from those two guys have made me very, very hesitant to buy into any argument of, well, if this goes right for this guy against big league pitching, maybe he could tap into more power. Like I bought into that for a while with Frelick, thinking that was going to be the case, and it has not happened. So, and it was similar. I was not a huge Terang guy offensively, but even that, like that doesn't help either when you kind of see what's happened to him at the big league level and how limited he's been. I will say though, what separates Durbin from those two guys a little bit is what you talked about. He pulls the ball a lot. And he also hits the ball at pretty ideal launch angles. So that combination it has helped him in the minor leagues to outperform his velocity off the bat pretty significantly. And I don't think that's entirely a fluke for the AAA playing environment. But like you talked about, once he gets into the big leagues, it gets a little hairy. I think that there's a pretty good chance that he could still be a decent doubles hitter in the big leagues because I looked at his spray chart in the minor leagues in 2024. A lot of the doubles power was because he was shooting line drives right down that left field line. And that does seem to be something he's actually pretty skilled at. Like I do think he's focusing on that spot. I think he's trying to pull the ball down the line. And when you do that on a line and you have even halfway decent speed, those are going to be doubles almost all the time. And that's kind of what the case was for him in 2024. So I think there's a decent chance that carries over. I don't think the home run power is going to carry over, though, based on just what I've looked at so far. I told you this before we jumped on here. Caleb Durbin hit 10 home runs in AAA in 2024. I believe all of them were to the pull side, which isn't crazy surprising. But 5 of those 10 home runs were hit under 100 miles an hour off the bat.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, man, but that's some pretty fluky stuff right there. And I think that's a good example of what you touched on a few minutes ago of it can work in the minor leagues when he's playing in smaller ballparks where the ball is flying more. Once he gets to the big leagues, is that going to keep happening? My guess is probably not. So this feels like a guy to me who could give you some doubles, but I gotta be honest, man, it's hard for me to see him hitting more than like 4 or 5 home runs in a full big league season right now, unless there's some crazy development coming in the power department, which I don't see happening. I asked Matt Arnold about it, though. Like I said, he said that the Brewers were encouraged by some of what they saw, number one, with the power numbers going up in the regular season. But he also pointed to what he's done in the Arizona Fall League this year. And this is also part of the equation, too, that neither of us have talked about a ton yet. he hit 5 home runs in the AFL in like 120 plate appearances. And
Mhm.
I haven't looked at, spray chart data or anything for that yet. So maybe if you dive into that a little bit, you start to see something that looks a little bit better. Maybe he was hitting the ball harder. I don't know. But to me, so much for him really just comes down to how much home run power is actually in there. And if the answer is very, very little, then my takeaway is kind of, it's a fine return for Devin Williams, but at some point, like I just don't know if repeatedly targeting the same kind of guy is always the best way for them to go.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that was my initial holdup on the deal as well, and I think that's carried through. I think I was hoping you would either get a younger starter, like we had talked about with a guy like Will Warren, or you are going to get with that secondary piece something along the lines of not really a lotto ticket, but somebody who had a ceiling you could at least dream on a little bit more, where you can see like, okay, there's potential for power, decent hit, and the glove and speed and everything else. Like that's what you're looking for, obviously, in every prospect. But it's harder to see it with somebody like Durbin, where it just feels like he's already kind of maxed out everything he's got, which good for him. He's clearly, I would imagine, this was we should note this is a D3 guy who's made his way into the top 30 prospects for the Yankees and now the Brewers by most accounts, and like a guy who's really worked his way to this spot and probably has reached pretty close to his like 99th percentile outcome right now in his career, and that's really good for him and impressive. And um, it gives you a good idea of the work ethic and everything else that he has. So you can see why the Brewers would like a guy like that. But you also, like you said, at some point, when do you can't fill a roster with Sal Freliks and Bryce Terangs and Caleb Durbins and expect to win. Like you just can't. You have to have those higher upside guys, and obviously the Brewers have guys like Mitchell, who we've talked about. There's a lot of upside there. Obviously Churrio's already reaching his upside and showing how much more he has in the tank as well. Like they have some of those guys around the roster. It's just I worry once you start getting into the third of a batting order filled with these types of guys. Like I don't know.
Mhm.
That concerns me a little bit, but um, overall, like you said, I think it's fair value. I don't think the Brewers got, shafted on the deal or anything here. I don't think the Yankees, some people were like, oh, the Yankees crushed them here. Like, I don't think that's the case. I think it's reasonable for both sides. And mainly because I do think Nestor Cortez, if he's healthy, is the Brewers' second best starter next year. And that's valuable. Like, that's really valuable. Um, but yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see what they do with Durbin. I think looking forward, I agree with you. I think they will be. I personally believe that they will add another infielder of some sort. We've talked about guys like Yohan Moncada, names like that. I think those would still be on the table after this type of trade. I don't think those come off the table in any way because of this deal. But just looking back to my plan specifically, like I would like Durbin to fill the John Birdie type of role that I had kind of laid out
Mhm.
in my plan, rather than filling the third base or second base role. Like I would not feel super comfortable with the Brewers going into next season with Durbin, maybe Dunn. I like Dunn. I like Durbin. I think they're both fine players, but I wouldn't feel great about those two being your two options at third base heading into the season, or second base, or however they want to lay it out. So I'm hoping they make another move on the infield. And I I guess just to touch on one more thing here, I saw a lot of people who one either thought this pointed to another starting pitcher getting traded for the Brewers, or think that it absolutely should. I get it. I get it to an extent because they do have a lot of people now that seem to be fighting for a starting rotation spot. But we've talked about it a lot. I think there's Devin Williams. Or not Devin Williams. There's Brandon Woodruff that you have to worry about. There's Tobias Myers potentially regressing. There's DL Hall, questions with him. Ashby's probably not actually a starter. The Rule 5 guy that they just drafted is probably not actually a starter, though they're going to give him a chance. Like in the end, I think Cortez moves into your top two pitchers, and you just take that no matter what you have going on. I don't think the Brewers were like, oh, now we have more starting depth we could deal from. Maybe they will, but I don't think it necessitates a trade from the rotation. So, yeah, I mean, that would kind of wrap up how I feel about the trade. I don't know, Jack, if you have any other thoughts on it or anything else that we should discuss in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the summary of how we feel about it is probably not quite the direction we were expecting it to go, but the
Yeah.
value is fair. Cortez is for 1 year get, he's a pretty good get.
Yeah.
And he does profile as one of the Brewers' best starters. Now, you can make a case that he is their best starter now, even though you probably are still going to have Freddie Peralta in that top spot. So he's not a bad return. And then as far as Durbin being the long-term piece, very solid player, high floor guy, very Brewers-y type. The question is just, is this really the direction the Brewers should keep building, or should they shift the focus to some higher upside guys now that they already have many of these guys who are high floor and can be good players without hitting for power, but they're also pretty limited players because they can't hit for power. So I think that's the question there. And again, a lot of it comes down to how does it pan out for him? Because like we talked about, there's so many things that are tempting, make it tempting to put him into that same camp as Frelick and Terang and these kind of guys. But he does have that difference of at least getting closer to maximizing it by pulling it so much. And I think the question is really, are those pull side tendencies going to help him play up in the big leagues or not? I think that's really going to be the deal breaker for him. But I think that's a pretty good summary of how we feel about the deal. I guess a good way to wrap it up is just to kind of remind people why the Brewers would do something like this and kind of what their end game is here. And this is no different than the Brewers trading Josh Hader, trading Corbin Burns. If you are in a position where you are not going to pay someone who is about to leave as a free agent, you always have a decision to make about, is it better for both the short and long-term outlook of our club to keep him here for this final year and then either lose him in free agency for nothing, or maybe we extend him a qualifying offer and we get a draft pick back when he signs elsewhere? Or do we think that we can recoup enough long-term value by dealing him without dramatically hurting our ability to win in the current season or the upcoming season? When the Brewers had that decision that they were facing with Corbin Burns, they made the decision to trade him. And I think we can agree that was the decision we wanted them to make. And it was. They kept Willy Adames. I think we can agree that was the decision we wanted them to make, and they did. But then they traded Devin Williams, and I think we're in agreement here that that was the right way to go as well. For me, if the question is about a reliever, it's almost always a no-brainer. These are tricky decisions to make in general, but I think if the person in question, the player in question, is a one-inning relief pitcher, my answer almost every single time is going to be trade him. Relievers, even the very best relievers, usually have pretty short shelf lives. It's not worth it to re-sign them. It's very easy to, if you bring in enough promising relievers off the scrap heap, to get them to figure it out. We've seen that happen not only with the Brewers, it happens all across baseball, but the Brewers have gotten especially good at it as well. So I think that adds more incentive to it. Bottom line is, one-inning relievers, even closers, even the best closers, they have limited value because they have such a hyper-specific role. And I do think that position is among the most replaceable in baseball.
Yes.
It's a lot easier to replace that than a good starting pitcher. It's way easier to replace that than a very good starting shortstop like the Brewers had in Willy Adames. So I think that they played it right here. I would be willing to bet that almost any time moving forward that they have a really good relief pitcher who's approaching free agency, they are going to either trade him or strongly consider trading him. I think they did the right thing here. I think they got a fair value back for him. Is this the exact package I would have picked? Probably not. I think we have slightly different thoughts on what the best package would have been for the Brewers to get that balance of short and long-term value. But those also seem to be based on things that we're probably valuing a little bit differently at this point in time than the Brewers are. The Brewers took the package that they thought was going to give them that right balance. That's what Matt Arnold said. He said that they liked the balance they got there. And it did seem like there were quite a few teams in on Devin Williams, so I think the Brewers did have some options.
Mhm.
I highly doubt they had to settle for this package. I'm sure they got other bids, especially because somebody like St. Louis's closer, Ryan Helsley, was supposedly not on the market anymore. They pulled him off, don't plan on trading him. I think the Brewers found the right balance. They found something they liked. They found a profile that they liked, and then they found a guy who can, again, slot towards the top of that rotation. And they felt that that was about as good of a return as they were going to get according to their models and according to what they felt was going to help them out most, both now and in the future. And now we'll see how it ages. So, like I said, relievers have limited value. I think they're about as replaceable as any position in baseball. So, with all that in mind, you look at what the Brewers have behind Devin Williams to replace him. You look at how they did without Devin Williams for a good chunk of the year. And then you look at what they got back, even if it wasn't the package that I would have liked to see, not in terms of value, but in terms of just the profiles they got back,
Yep.
particularly like a guy like Durbin. And even as much as I like Cortez now, the 1 year of control thing, again, is a little bit different than what we've seen them do before. But I think all told, it's a fair trade. It's a fine trade. I think that's my final grade. Like if I had to give it a grade from the Brewers perspective, I don't know, like a B,
Yep.
B grade, maybe a B minus. It's fine. I think it's okay. I think Cortez is going to help them in 24. I'm just a little skeptical that Durbin is the the best kind of profile that they could have targeted in this deal. But again, time will tell because he does have that pull side tendency that could help him out a little bit more than we're giving him credit for.
Yeah. And I guess just to wrap it up for me, I was listening to Robert Murray's YouTube show that he's been doing throughout the winter meetings all week, really. And they were talking about the trade, and he obviously has a lot of Brewers connections. And he just kind of mentioned that he said, the initial thought is like, who's the short guy, stockier guy who played infield for Pat Murphy early in his career? And he's like, Dustin Pedroia. And he's like, so I asked the Brewers, of course. And he's like, is this somebody that you view as that type of player? And of course, the Brewers guy goes, well, it's hard to not see that type of, profile, that type of similarity. Now, Pedroia got to power in the big leagues. He had some pop in his bat. But I do think that's kind of one of the things here is that the Brewers probably see this as a guy that maybe without the power, but scrappy, hard-nosed player, steals bases, plays defense well. I'm sure they're looking at it as like, we might have found like a Dustin Pedroia light here that we can have work with the guy who kind of helped him get to where he was. So that'll be interesting. I agree with what you said earlier. We're going to hear about Durbin every day of spring training from Pat Murphy. There's going to be a Caleb Durbin shout out every day. I think as soon as the trade broke, I texted one of my friends that Pat Murphy's going to absolutely love this guy. Like it was an immediate, like, yeah, this is his guy for sure. But yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think it's fine value. It's a reasonable trade. I would say B-ish type of grade on it, but it's probably a little different than we would have gone if we were in the shoes, but we also don't know what was on the table in terms of offers. And like you said, I would imagine there were a decent amount of them out there. The Brewers felt comfortable taking this deal. And to be 100% honest with you guys, it's hard for me to doubt Matt Arnold on too many things. Obviously, I form my own opinions. I have my own thoughts on stuff, but for the most part, he has proven to know what he's doing and to make moves that help the Brewers continue to push forward in a winning direction. And it becomes hard to put too much doubt on these types of moves, or to at least not trust that he had good reason to make this type of move, I guess. So that's how I would kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I would agree with that last part. The only thing that's giving me pause here is you can make an argument that like the only thing the Brewers have not done well under David Stearns and now Matt Arnold is develop power.
Yeah.
Churio seems to be like the only guy so far who has really shown that at the big league level. And Churio also just had this incredible natural ability to begin with. But so far, they do not have a good track record with helping other guys maximize their power. They just don't.
Yeah.
I mean, even a guy like William Contreras, who hits the ball a million miles an hour, they can't get him to elevate the ball. And again, maybe they're not trying super hard to get him to elevate the ball. I don't know, because there's always the risk you run of trying to overhaul a guy who's already a good hitter. But they have not maximized power for, guys like Bryce Terang or guys like Sal Frelick. And there have been times too where it seems like they've tried it in the past. Like there were rumors that that's what they tried to do with Keston Hiura, and it kind of got the ball rolling on some of the issues that ended up tanking his career. So maybe they're hesitant to go back to it. I don't know. But I mean, when you see Sal Frelick's hitting 2 home runs a year in the big leagues, Bryce Terang's hitting like 7 home runs a year in the big leagues, and even that's probably pretty good for him. It's hard to see him getting anywhere beyond that unless he can start hitting the ball a little harder. Again, Durbin gives you that flash of hope because he pulls more. Bryce and Sal were always use all fields type hitters and go oppo a lot. That was kind of their game. But for the Brewers to actually get a guy like this to hit for enough power to be a good big league hitter, I'm sorry, I'm not going to believe it till I see it, because that's where we're at right now. They've earned the benefit of the doubt from me on just about everything else. They have not earned the benefit of the doubt from me on this. This is like the one area where they just have not done a good job. I hope this is kind of a change and that this works out a little more. If you can get Durbin to be a guy who hits double-digit home runs a year, even like 10 to 12 a year, you're looking at an above-average hitter, I think, and all of a sudden that changes the outlook of it a lot. But if he is a guy kind of like I'm fearing, who is going to have a tough time exceeding like 5 home runs a year in the big leagues, it gets a little trickier now. But we'll see how it all unfolds. And I think that's really all we have for today. We said we'd try to keep this one a little shorter, so we'll be back with everybody on Thursday night of the coming week is when we're going to record our next normal episode, where you can expect to hear us talk for 2 hours. If we get any more information or anything new that we learn about any of these players or about the deal, we'll cover it then. So if there's anything we want to update or maybe change our minds about, we'll circle back to it. But otherwise, the Brewers have made some other moves as well. We'll cover that in the next full episode. A couple of lefties joining the organization on the 40-man roster who could potentially make an impact in 2024. So we'll touch on all that as well. But until then, thank you all for listening to the Emergency Pod, and go Brewers.